Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Every Day is a Story All Its Own. It's January 1st, 2019. We're making this video, and this is about the third part of the three threes of good storytelling. In the first part, I talked about the basics, the who or the characters, the where, which are the places, and the what, which is the main problem. In the second episode, I moved on to what I call the basics, the beginning, the middle, and the end. Here in this third part, we're going to talk about what could be considered the most complex of the three, and we'll continue to talk about them as the show goes on from the perspective of the actor, the director, and of course the writer. And these I call the mechanics, and they are the circumstances, they're the conflict, and they're the climax. So they're the three C's of the three threes. Are you ready to tell your story? Okay, so this is very exciting. For a writer, for an actor, for a director, this to me is some of the most interesting stuff that you're working with when you're trying to bring a story to life. Now, these three threes, what I call the mechanics, the circumstances, the conflict, and of course the climax, these all really help you construct your plot, unfold the narrative. The character arcs, of course, play into it. So there's a lot going on here. So what I've decided to do to make this as manageable as possible, at least, in the first time that we're talking about this here, is I decided to use a certain film that we're going to go back to over and over again through the course of this episode in order to talk about these things. And the film that I've chosen is the 1990 film Joe versus the Volcano. Now, this was written and directed by John Patrick Shanley. This movie is a great candidate for a lot of reasons that I'm going to get into. But right off, to get us started, Shanley was a playwright. As a matter of fact, a very successful and decorated one. He won for his play Doubt both the Pulitzer Prize for Drama and also a Tony Award. And then he went on to win an Oscar for his screenplay Moonstruck. Cher and Nicolas Cage, it's famous, in a lot of ways. So anyway, we're going to talk about Joe versus the Volcano today, and it's very interesting, Joe versus the Volcano. It was met with a lot of critical discussion. Not everyone was happy with it. Shanley had to completely redo the end after they tested the film with audiences, and the ending really does work now. I would encourage you, if you're interested in the film, watch it, see how I apply these things and what you can get from it, to do a little research about that alternate ending. Well, anyway, before we move on to the first one, which is circumstances, I just want to say that Joe versus the Volcano is also interesting because it really takes the two kinds of story, the stranger in a strange land and boy meets girl, and it melds them together in a really interesting fable. So let's move on now to circumstances. So let's get into the circumstances. I first encountered the word circumstances in the world of storytelling when I was training as an actor, when I was studying under something called the Meisner method. Now, the Meisner method was named for Sandy Meisner, who was a very famous and successful acting teacher who taught in New York for a really long time. Well, Sandy said to his actors that their job was to live truthfully under imaginary circumstances. And I love that. It covers it all. To live, to fully invest, to be this character in the time that you're in the world of the story. Like nothing else exists except that world at that time for you being this character. And then to behave truthfully, to live truthfully. So important. No artifice, no fake, terrible acting 101 stuff, not a lot of gestures, not a lot of unnecessary business, but just following through on the wants and the needs of the character. And then circumstances. So what were circumstances? Well, as I began to do more and more writing in my own world of storytelling, I wanted to break down circumstances for myself and for the students I was beginning to teach in a very easy way. And so I came up with a mathematical concept for it, going back to the basics of the three threes of good storytelling. So circumstances are to me how the place, the where, plus the main problem affects the behavior, the way the main character lives. And that's really what we're going to discuss today using the film Joe versus the Volcano. So Joe versus the Volcano is a myth. It's a fairy tale. It's set up very clearly that way. There's a card that opens the film and white letters on a black screen, sure to catch your attention. Once upon a time, there was a guy named Joe. Now, Joe's circumstances at the start of the film are horrible. He used to be a fireman. He used to be a hero. He used to take chances. He truly loved life. But then he got scared. We all understand that. We all get scared at times. Well, Joe got so scared that he took his soul, which is the knife. When we think about part 2, when I talked about David Mamet's 3 uses of the knife, well, the soul in Joe versus Volcano is the knife. And the soul is put away in a little box and is sold, as Joe says, for $300 a week to a medical supply company where he's in a horrible office with fluorescent lights, horrible coffee, zombied out coworkers, a boss who abuses his power and has no understanding of how to accomplish his goals in any kind of really good, positive way. And so Joe has his soul locked in a box along with everyone else in the company. But then his circumstances change. The first way that his circumstances change is he goes to see a doctor because Joe is a hypochondriac. He never feels well. And the doctor tells him that he has this terminal disease called a brain cloud. Remember, it's a fairy tale. And that he's going to die in 6 months. So Joe quits his job. Phase 1 of changing his circumstances. But then something kind of interesting happens. Next time we see Joe, he's in his apartment. He's in his bathrobe. He's in a horrible, dingy, as one of the characters say, not nice, dirty apartment. So he hasn't really answered the call to adventure until he gets a knock on the door by a nefarious billionaire businessman who makes him an offer. He says, Joe, I need this material to make these things I make called superconductors. I have no idea how they work, but I know I need this element. I know I need this mineral. And the people on this island, the only thing they'll trade is someone who's willing to jump into their volcano to appease their god. So again, it's very mythological, very fairy tale. An act has to be done, an act of sacrifice to appease the gods so that the community can prosper. So Joe, having no other circumstances that are really working for him, that are pushing him, Joe agrees to do this. Now he sells his soul now for some money, for some adventure. He goes out, he buys new clothes. He's starting to change his circumstances. He says yes to the call to adventure, and so he goes out and he begins to gather magical items. These 4 traveling steamer trunks, all kinds of things that later come into the movie. They're sort of Chekhov's gun. Those things that we see them and then they're used to help him in his adventure. He encounters very different and kind of funny mentors, as you would in any kind of myth when your circumstances change and you're about to cross a threshold. And then he finally does, and he goes out on this island. Now, in the course of his adventures, he meets a woman. He meets 3 women, and they're all played by Meg Ryan. And they all sort of, when you think about the character continuum that I've talked about before, the character that he actually takes the voyage with on the ship to this island, goes through the story with, she's in the middle. She could go either way. Sometimes she's an extrovert, sometimes she's an introvert, sometimes she's pushing herself, sometimes she's settling. So she's a great secondary character for us to also take the journey with. She's very identifiable. And so on the other extremes, the other 2 characters she plays is an introvert. She's a secretary in the office where Joe initially works, named Dee Dee, and she's very scared of life. So when Joe kind of comes alive and he's going to do this thing, but then he tells her he's going to die, but in the meantime he's going to do this very heroic thing, she freaks out. She wants nothing to do with him. On the other end of the character continuum is the extrovert, and this is Angelica. Now she's the character that Joe takes the journey with. It's her sister. And Angelica is a poet, she's a painter, but she's also messed up. Her life is very dark. Her soul is just very befuddled. She's taking her father's money. She kind of knows she sold her soul to this nefarious guy, and she knows what she needs to do to get out of it. But for Angelica, she just can't answer that call to adventure. And so Joe leaves one island. He leaves Staten Island, like he says. He gets in this boat and he goes to a new place. He goes to this island. And so the main problem, I'm dying and I have to make something of my life. interacts with this new place. First, really, the ship, and then also when he gets to the island, which is the main place that really, really presses him, and he has to make something of his life. That's how it works. He says yes to the call of adventure, he changes his circumstances, and he's off to the races. And once he's committed, there's plenty of conflict, which we're going to talk about next. So let's move on to conflict. Now, we don't have to spend a lot of time defining conflict. We live in a world where there's plenty on all kinds of levels, on a global level, on a community level, on a country level, all kinds of conflict. Family, all of those kinds of things. We're all experiencing conflict. But how does it really work efficiently and cleanly and getting your job done in story? Well, conflicts is simply X versus Y. Now, in really interesting conflicts, there can't really be a compromise. In real life, we need much more compromise, more communication, more compromise. But in stories, compromise is very, very rarely works out well in the story as far as audience satisfaction and really accomplishing the goals of the story. So anyway, conflict, X versus Y. Only one person's going to get their way. Just a quick example from life. The babysitter says bedtime at 8 o'clock. The 5-year-old kid says, I am not going to bed. Only one of them is going to win. Now, maybe there will be a little compromise and it'll be 8:15. And any of us who are parents, or if you remember when you were a kid, probably said, come on, 5 more minutes, 3 more minutes. Come on, just 1 more minute. So there's a little bit of that. And every story has some form of that. So in Joe versus the Volcano, we're thinking of conflict in terms of wants, needs, desires, obstacles, and of course solving the problem. Joe needs to get his purpose back. He's going to jump into the volcano to reactivate the hero in him, reactivate life. And in order to do it, he's pursuing death. That's Joe's particular problem, which again, I think we can all relate to on some level, no matter what it may be. So anyway, what's really, really important in the conflict, especially in Joe versus the Volcano, is the journey itself. Because there's the seas and the boat winds up actually sinking and they get to the island on the 4 trunks. Obviously, spoiler alert, when we're looking at a movie in this level, of course, there's going to be spoilers. So anyway, here he is in the midst of a conflict. Now, another thing that John Patrick Shanley does in this movie that I love, that I think is totally instructive, is how he looks at the conflict. Again, he doesn't want to make choices. Again, not stranger in a strange land or boy meets girl, but both. And so there are 3 kinds of conflict that we're taught in classical storytelling. One is man versus man. Again, we know that very well. Man versus nature. Well, we have that because they're on this yacht, they're going to the island, and they get caught in a vicious storm. Again, either the ship is going to survive the storm or it isn't. And because the circumstances are high, and because it's a fairy tale and it's a story with a lot of stakes, nature wins. We also have man versus society. This is idea of selling your soul to the company, selling your soul, deferring your dream to make other people happy, to fit in, to conform, to do that thing that so many of us do. Creatives struggle against it all the time and sometimes fall into the trap of doing it when the fear and the frustration happen. And so my next episode after this one is going to be about dealing with doubt for creatives, because the conflicts are real and they're difficult and they could kill the soul, put it in a box of a creative. And I always hate to see that happen. So anyway, Joe gets beaten down. He gets beaten down by other people, like his boss. He gets beaten down by the circumstances that come from taking this voyage on a vicious ocean. He gets beaten down by society, by community, telling him he's not good enough anymore, that he doesn't have the self-worth, he has too much fear, and all these different kinds of things. And that's the way the conflict works. Joe has to get to the island. He has to summon the courage and dismiss the fear that will allow him to jump in. And very basically, that is how conflict works. So let's move on to the climax. Okay, so now we come to the climax. The climax is the high point of the story. What's very important in the climax, it's also the turning point of the story. So if we think of David Mamet when he says that every story is the movement from a lie to a truth, when we do the climax, when we experience it, when the characters go through it, we know now what the truth of the matter is. The hero has achieved. The hero was worthy. Things were going to happen. In Joe versus the Volcano, again, it's so simple and so clear. It's Joe jumping into the volcano. Now, he has to take action. That's very, very important. Your protagonist, your main character, your hero or heroine, they have to take action. So if Joe is pushed into the volcano against his will, that doesn't count for a good climax. Also, it has to involve someone else other than the secondary character. Joe versus the Volcano, Patricia, who's the girl, the one in the middle who we also take the journey with, she declares her love for Joe. There's the boy meets girl, a little bit of the romantic comedy element in the stranger in a strange land story. And so she says, I am going to go with you. Now, they're married by the chief, by the Toby. Again, here comes the soul. This is holding on to your soul. This is living with it fully. And so he has this little doll that he says that is his soul, that's represented by this magical object. And so again, here we have the soul. Well, Joe is living fully in his soul. I have to do this. I love you, but I can't go against my word. Patricia tries to talk him out of it, but he knows what his destiny is. She tries everything. She says, the chief doesn't even want you to jump in. But Joe knows that this is his one chance to really open up his life, even if it's for the last couple minutes of it, and really do this thing. So it's important, really important, that that main character acts. And in this case, what is the character, the outside character, to give the story proper scope, that acts with the protagonist? It's the volcano. The volcano is personified by someone dressed in a mask. Now, it's very interesting because it's a fable. There's a lot of reinforcing symbols that are going on in Joe versus the Volcano. So if you look very closely, the opening shot of the factory where Joe works, where he sold his soul, matches exactly in design the mask of this character. That's the personification of the volcano. So very important, Shanley is using the mythology, using metaphor in order to accomplish the proper scope in the story by having this third character interact with the protagonist outside the secondary character. Well, what happens in Joe versus a Volcano? They are blown out of the volcano. The volcano and the island sink, but what's really important here is not that Joe dies. That doesn't solve the problem. It's doing the heroic act, reclaiming your soul, not killing your soul dead. That's not the third use of the knife. So that's how we know that. Okay, so he comes and he does his thing, and now it's time to leave. It's time to return. So we go very quickly to the ending after the climax. We go to what's called the denouement, the tying up, and it's a very small scene. It was a very different scene than the original, like I said. Patricia and Joe are on a raft in the middle of nowhere. He finds out that the doctor is a fake. He's a phony. Joe doesn't have a brain cloud, and that he's going to be okay. But he immediately starts to create the hypochondriac behavior. The circle goes again where he's going back to where he was. But no. He, together with Patricia, her love, sees him through, and we know he's going to be okay. So again, those are the elements that make a climax work. So we've come to the end of the third section of the 3 threes, what I call the 3 C's of the 3 threes. We've completed that cycle, and now we're going to go on. I told you that one of the next episodes is going to be dealing with doubt. We have a couple of other really good top 10, very motivational episodes coming up for you. One is going to be my top 10 favorite books on structure and narrative. The other one will be about books that are motivational, that will keep you going, keep you creatively charged as creatives, telling your story, doing your thing. I want to thank everyone. This is going really well. People are watching. We're getting great comments, great feedback. We're doing our best to adjust each time. I'm learning the technology. Hopefully it looks a little better. It sounds a little better each time. I believe that we're getting there. So please like it, subscribe. Thanks to everyone who has subscribed. And I want to let you know that in order to get a notification, you have to click the little bell after you subscribe, and then you'll get a note saying, hey, there's a new video, and you can can learn some more about story. So thank you all. Have a great day. Have a great 2019. And remember, every day truly is a story all its own. Bye now.